Okay, I'm going to recapitulate some threads or some issues that came up in a live stream discussion that I had with other people, and I think I synthesized an idea which answers a broader question about what is it? What is the woke identitarian cultural movement? What is it in terms of naming the demon, as it were? How does this Hydra? What is the basic nature of this Hydra? But I want to broaden that particular question as well to include how to generally understand the different components or factions within the culture war, because it's not just, I don't see it as two factions. I see it as more than two factions. There is a third faction which is a kind of halfway house, which is a bit of both, or seeming ostensibly pretends to be on both sides. And I want to talk to that phenomena because I think it's explained by getting into the first issue that I've just outlined. So let me get on with it. So this is a recapitulation of things that exist within the 8.5 sort of hour recording that I uploaded, which is a whole series of recordings that were stringed together. And this is also a kind of extraction of some of the things that I discussed on a live stream on Good Mother's YouTube channel. Uh, so yeah, I guess I'm not going to fully recapitulate my whole intellectual edifice, my whole analysis of this, because that will take too long. But essentially, this has to do with deconstructing the narrative which is used and what is actually going on behind the narrative. So there are a whole lot of properties about narrative inception and people representing as in agents that speak on behalf of a kind of matrix and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not going to recapitulate that, so I'm just going to put that slightly to one side. Um, but to say that, and the general psychological properties, I call them cerebral histrionics, so of people that have a kind of spiritual hurdle which and developmental obstacle which they never graduated from. So they're sort of stuck in an arrested development and they kind of grift. They play a game where they're relying on an external locus of control and they're relying on some kind of sort of token of merit. There's some kind of idolatry, some kind of reductionism that they can have a kind of rationalistic sort of intellectual economy about that helps them insulate their own existential angst and helps them sort of, facilitate death denial. This is almost explained quite well, perhaps, in terror management theory. I think terror management theory is not, it's not something that I completely agree with, but I think it perfectly describes the frame of reference of a cerebral histrionic. They see the world through terror management theory, essentially, and they think that there's nothing else in town. There's no alternative. They won't sort of try to overcome that hurdle, that philosophical, spiritual challenge, as it were. They won't sort of overcome that. Anyway, so what narratives all have in common, at least the kinds of narratives with cerebral histrionics that I described, what they all have in common is they all have scapegoats. Now, there are people with older variants of this that don't comport with the current woke identitarian movement in the culture war. I put Sam Harris in this camp. The scapegoat that Sam Harris has is of a different ilk to the kind of identitarian scapegoat. Sam Harris's scapegoat is free will. So it's philosophical, it's very esoteric. He's capable of dispersing that kind of philosophical conflation and false equivalent. He can just kind of, so he can almost sound like he's a very rational person, and he can rely on scientism, and he's like, well, science is all we have. That's his consolation to the narrative that, well, we all have to huddle under the umbrella of science and science will give us our marching orders, it will give us our moral prescriptions, science is the answer, there's no alternative. And that is his narrative program, that is his sociological plan that is attached to his utopian vision or maximized utilitarianism. And at the same time, he can pay lip service maybe to some classical liberal values, and he can join the fight in the culture wars on some fronts. So because he sticks out to the identitarians because they have different scapegoats. So because he is a different scapegoat to the identitarians, he looks like he might be on our side. He looks like he might be anti-woke. And in some technical way, he is anti-woke, but he's another variant of the same hydralisk, of the same narrative formula. So, and the same thing is with Russell Brand. Because if you try to dismantle them from their narrative, you cut one head, two heads grow back. Because he can always just kind of get into the circular rationalization, because he's depending on an external locus of control. He's invoking a false authority, essentially. And he always has a nice sounding excuse. Well, we must have an external locus of control. We must have an external authority. Otherwise, there can be no agreement. So sort of from first principles, he is incepted into a narrative, and he will only accept a narrative format answer to the question, as it were. And this makes his intellectualism brittle and toxic. And anyway, I'm not going to go through all of those facets. I've got recordings that deal with that. But so now let me talk about what specifically the scapegoats are in the identitarian narrative. The scapegoats are twofold. They are male and they are white. And I think white is the primary one. And male is equivalent to white, but it is a perfect reflection of white. So it's sort of like white is the primary and male is the secondary, but the secondary has a moral equivalence of perpetrator status. The male is just as evil as white. Male is the same as white in its problematic scapegoating role in the narrative. And because they have two pillars, they can always fly from the one to the other. If you try to debunk their accusatory framing of reality and their gaslighting against the one, then they'll advance the other. They can switch to the other. Because the other is different, but it's also the same. And because of that paradox, they can play a continuous rational shell game, and they can divert pressure of having to justify or substantiate their narrative from basic reasoning and having coherent thinking. They don't have any of that coherence because they've got one thing that is the same as the other thing, but it's also different. So because they've got two targets, they can switch between these two targets. They can play whack-a-mole. They can divert scorn. Now, this is essentially, this is a kind of hucksterism. This is a kind of game. And, but because it follows this sort of basic rational equivalency at the ground floor, because it's almost axiomatic that these are the two scapegoats, you can always just stop reasoning coherently about things and say, well, it's a moral panic, it's a moral emergency, we have to defeat these two evils. We can't talk about it too much or we won't do anything about it. So they can always grift and make progress like that. And that single trick is the trick that is, if you cut one head, two grows in its place. That is essentially what it is. Now, I would say Sam Harris has the same thing, but it's less explicit. This false equivalency is more convoluted within Sam Harris's thing. I haven't actually given it too much thought to think about what it is in Sam Harris's thing, because it's more philosophical and esoteric. So it might be that free will or the let's say the closest we can get to enjoying whatever emergent property that Sam Harris thinks makes us think that we have free will, the appearance of free will, is the same as conscription into some kind of scientific, rational, moral, computational brainiac device. Brainiac being the Superman comic book supercomputer that ruled Krypton, and that at the same time was destroying the Kryptonians and destroying their world because it only cared about itself, and because the Kryptonians were stupid enough to make a machine that could actually tell them, that was expected to tell the Kryptonians, I understand science and reality and truth, and you're too stupid to understand those things. So you just have to ask me for answers and I'll give them to you, but don't expect to understand them because it's beyond your pay grade. And so you've put things beyond the pay grade of your own understanding. And so there's this kind of mystery box, there's this kind of mystery sort of magic, which you when you stare at the abyss stares back. And so you have this kind of idea that what we think is free will, the best way that it can be optimized is sort of enslavement to some kind of brainiac displacement and understanding that we don't have free will. So it's based in a kind of self-denigration, or based on sort of denigrating the very concept of understanding, that there is no such thing as understanding. And so and then having to sort of put up with some kind of consolation, some kind of supplementary alternative. So one can argue, I mean, look, so maybe there's a slight difference between Sam Harris's narrative grifting and the identitarians, because at least in the esoteric philosophical thing, I mean, it's the whole thing is purely abstracted, whereas in the identitarian wokeism thing, the scapegoats is about history. It's about, I mean, I guess, it's a slightly different drama. It's a different way of dramatizing the narrative. That it's more esoteric in Sam Harris's case. But anyway, I mean, like, proto-fascism and this kind of narrative grifting always has sort of exoteric and esoteric versions of itself, which is why you get such different sort of levels of occult within, sort of fascistic structures, that you have a completely different view of the, sort of it's exactly like Brave New World when you look at the world controllers, anyway, so and in some sense, Sam Harris perhaps is slightly different in that he wants everyone to adopt this mentality of sort of the cynical world-controlling sort of compromise, or sort of cynical. So at least perhaps there's a greater transparency in Sam Harris's intellectualism, that he's honest about the narrative. He's more intellectually honest about the deployment of the narrative, as it were. He's not trying to do a magic trick to some degree, although I think some of the rationalizations are essentially magic tricks, and that's all they are at the end of the day. When you actually get into the meat of his discourse, it is a waste of time to associate yourself with, because it is just like being lobbed skepticism, and because somehow he holds the default position, he doesn't shoulder the burden of proof, you shoulder the burden of proof, somehow he just inherits the orthodoxy. And that is perhaps a bit of, that's the version of the hysterical moral emergency panic that the identitarians and that the moral woke people do. But because Sam Harris is doing it sort of in intellectual language and not, perhaps it seems slightly more benign. But I would argue it's a slightly different variant of the same formulaic denigration, as it were. In the end, you're still subordinated to, I mean, I don't see it any different to a pagan skyfather version of God. The narrative becomes the All-Father or something. And in some sense, there might just be the real only difference between these sorts of, because I mean, this is a political theme that you can see. I mean, this is the same as in Nazi Germany, the same as in even Russia. That perhaps the only distinction is that in Russia, everyone is meant to, in the esoteric intellectualism of the sort of indoctrination of the USSR, everyone is co-jointly a Führer. Whereas in, let's say, the proto-fascist and identitarian thing, there is this idea of having a revolutionary this is going to sound like I'm historically uninformed because I'm going to say revolutionary vanguard, and obviously in Russian intellectual theory they had a vanguard, but okay, I'm not going to deal with cleaning that issue up because it's going to blunt the point that I'm making now, but I could make but essentially in the Nazi society you don't have to be an agent of the narrative so long as in the fascist version you are encouraged to seek tutelage or to, as long as that you're sort of, you regiment yourself and you support the right person, you can have a kind of vicarious salvation through somebody else's consciousness of sort of backing the right horse. So, okay, sorry, somewhat, maybe this is not such an important distinction to make, but I mean, this is, I think, the slight difference between, in some sense, it's the emphasis, or it has to do with the nature of the scapegoat itself. So because Sam Harris's scapegoat is something like the illusion of free will, everyone has to be schooled in it. But because other people's scapegoat is like the Jews or the 1%, then it doesn't matter if people believe it or not. It just matters if there's a kind of revolutionary witch hunt to clean them up. So it really just has to do with the nature of the scapegoat that then determines the mechanics of the utopian drive or the political project, or the interventionists, sort of ideological fervor. But yeah, but essentially the thing that they all have in common is essentially this obsession with the narrative. Which, another way of putting that is that it's fundamentally sort of anti-liberal. And they all, in some sense, work as fast as they can to accelerate to the point of redefining culture or bringing into cultural consciousness or creating radical rhetoric and other forms of hyperrealism to bring into view, in some sense, something like the liberal paradox, which they give themselves permission to broach and to breach, in defense of needing to take out this higher scapegoat. And obviously some people, where their scapegoat is more diffuse and more intellectual and esoteric, that doesn't happen. So Sam Harris can't just say, well, everyone should be indoctrinated in school about the illusion of free will and about the only viable alternative being huddling under scientism, giving us our marching orders, and us taking our moral prescriptions from scientists or some kind of methodological computational computer. Although I'm sure he would be thrilled if he could do that, but I think, then perhaps his whole project would run aground practically, and he might get some feedback as to essentially how pitiful his particular philosophical view is, and how sort of poorly crafted and insufficient it is at supporting a culture that has any kind of integrity and any kind of ability to reproduce itself. I'm sure it could be capable of reproducing itself, but the kind of repression and dogmatic slumber that would have to be imposed by a kind of brittle authority that would have to upkeep that kind of ideological taxation would be hideous. Watch movies like The Giver, for instance. Anyway, and in some sense, Sam Harris already concedes this point, in some sense that he says, well, maybe we shouldn't. A lot of people can't intellectually live up to this truth, and the illusion of free will is such a strong, motivating, social, cohesive. Anyway, I can't. Okay, I guess I'm going to say things that are slightly incorrect to criticizing Sam Harris, because I don't read his work because I can't be bothered to waste my life in that way, but I know that the quality of his work is not has. You can't call him a philosopher with a serious face. You can't call him an intellect. You can't call him a serious intellectual. He's a pseudo intellectual, and in some sense, I think by definition you almost have to be a kind of pseudo intellectual to be a neuroscientist that thinks that you can make a kind of philosophical contribution. There are very clever neuroscientists, and the best ones are very humble of this point, and they just do their job, and they make the meager progress that is capable of being made, which is ingredients for some other more intellectual person to make a grander synthesis and to build towards something like that, and to map certain physiological correlations. But there's going to be no philosophy. The what do they call the hard problem is not going to be solved in this way. The hard problem of human consciousness. But anyway, let me just move away. But yeah, so look, I'm talking a little bit broadly and off the cuff, but just to expand on the point of the various look, all of these movements get very esoteric. They get very convoluted. They get very intricate and complicated, and they think that this sophistication, which they develop as a credential towards the idea that they could be a kind of totalitarian, that they could command a dogmatic orthodoxy, and that they would be a worthy authoritarian component of a society that would be more successful. They have to pretend that at the very least, and so they do have to develop a kind of sophistication in this way. And so you have to have your bank of armchair philosophers that cerebrate and that come up with building this abstracted third person perspective view of the scapegoating relativism. And it's very easy to do that, because as soon as you've got a way to vent all the pressure in your philosophical system, as soon as you've got an arch evil nemesis, then all you have to do is react to what you project onto your nemesis. So all you have to do to make the world a better place is to bring equilibrium to the narrative, is to counter the force of evil. And so you don't have to define what is good, and you don't have to define vitality and positive values and coherence and affirmation. You just have to be reactive. You just have to be destructive, targeting the right scapegoat, and using means and vectors that land damage on that scapegoat. And then if you don't get what you want, then you just say, well, that's because the damage now we're discovering that the damage that the scapegoat provided to the system was actually more insidious than we thought. It was more esoteric, and then it becomes an issue of social psychology. It starts getting more and more both vague, but also dispersed, and somewhat, esoterically diluted, and you end up and fascism is much better at controlling that issue of hiding the truth from the exoteric masses, from the plebs, as it were. It's much better at pulling the wool over people's eyes. At least the USSR had one virtuous thing about it, is that it actually collapsed under the weight of its own contradiction. The people themselves sort of knew that the whole thing was a disaster. I think fascism is so despicable and virulent and self-stupefying, and that I think that they would have eventually bred an underclass of people that were essentially, that couldn't understand words anymore, because everything would have been orientated towards the scapegoat, because that's what you end up having to do. You have to end up, I mean, even when Germany was winning the war, the book burnings and that's when the conspiracy theory was at its height, the Jewish conspiracy theory. Because even when all the Jews were locked up in the concentration camps, the conspiracy theory was already an infiltration of the mind. It was already on the scale of white privilege. It was already in that vector of conspiracy theory and delusion and projection. So you get more and more hyper-realism. And I don't think that you can I think that it will eventually just force people to... You have to sacrifice all of your reasoning faculty to it. You can't have any independent shred of thinking left inside of you, I think, by the end of it. Encoding your reality into alignment with the dogma. And so, yeah, I mean, I do think that the curse of the Hydra is that you end up, even if you go along with it, you end up slaying some of the heads yourself and then two heads take its place. I think that it can't actually, you can't have it be static for too much, because then it doesn't, it kind of has to, I think it's like a fire. If it's not getting bigger, it's dying. And that is somewhat the curse of it. But as I said, I think fascism has more tools to contrive the expansion of the fire, as it were, to control the expansion of the fire. So at least it'll be the Führer's decision, it'll be the representative guardian, the savior of the system, the savior of the narrative, who will decide. And that also facilitates a kind of cognitive dissonance, because then you have to say, we can't understand. It must be a mystery that is confined to the mind of the Führer. So we don't have to think about it. We can just take our marching orders. So the Führer is like the brainiac, who is like the representative of bringing order and justice and equilibrium to the narrative, and protecting us against the scapegoat. So there are elements of both, and I think that there are always elements of both in the current. I think the best way to understand the identitarian woke movement is that it is proto-fascist. Let me just make a claim. There was an interesting interaction that I had on a live stream when I said that I think that the male is a valid target and white is a valid target. And the black men on the live stream said, but have you seen the kind of abuse, the kind of name calling that is levied against black men? And I emphasized the point that I don't think I explicitly made before then, which is that these are separate targets. That I think that the kind of abuse that they were talking about was levied at them because they were male. That you wouldn't have a transgender paraplegic person of color being able to verbally accost and abuse a black female. I don't think that would happen, because the black female isn't male and isn't white. Not either male or not either white. And I do even think that male can be taken off the table, which is why transgenderism is not an issue, but transracialism is an issue, because that's why I say that I think that white is the primary scapegoat. Because if you don't have and so when males are being targeted, like in the black male example of being verbally abused, I think that essentially they are being treated as badly as they might as well be a white male in that scenario, because relative in that scenario, females verbally abusing males, in that scenario they represent the white male. They are taking on the sort of the evil of the whole system. So I do think that each of these targets are separate, but they end up being, there's a false equivalency that is a reductionist sort of equation, which the whole movement is premised on. But they are capable of ignoring the male aspect, so long as they can still very clearly not be shaken or be deprived of at least one scapegoat that the whole structure is resting upon. And let me just explain for a second what I mean by that the narrative is resting upon the scapegoat. The reason why this happens, essentially, is because it's for the revolutionary imagination, or the utopian imagination, is constructed out of the blood or the suffering or the inconvenience of the scapegoat, because of generalizations, because of disgusting moral generalizations. The scapegoat should have already in the past done something different, behaved differently, so that the complaint or the deficiency or the self-esteem that is lacking in the identitarian proponent, or that they judge to be lacking, would have already been provided for by the system, by the narrative. So using the narrative and using the scapegoat, which has a kind of built-in time machine between those two, the scapegoat could have already fixed the problem, should fix the problem now, and could fix the problem in the future, so long as they will take a kind of collective guilt, and they will get in line and be installed with this ideological program and sociological planning, as long as they just get with the program and they allow themselves to be treated like a monolith, like a faction, like an identitarian faction. And this also has this dehumanizing aspect that the category system that supports the identification of the scapegoat is the arbiter and let's say the way of locating and monitoring and tracking moral consideration. That moral consideration vests in the group entity. The source of moral consideration is in the is in the collective mass. And so as long as you're willing to treat people as representatives of that source of morality that vests in the collective mass, then the whole thing works. Which is why you have to have some matrix categorization that is prime and that cannot be broken, and that obviously is race. Which is why white is basically the prime scapegoat, but it does have a secondary one. And this is also how they can make cultural progress, sort of with the Mott and Bailey sort of strategy, is that, well, you can have feminists that keep the torch alight and aflame, and then you can sort of keep on relighting the expeditionary inroads into advancing the intersectional variant, and if that gets sort of gummed up or impeded, then you can kind of switch tactics, and the one is more secure than the other. The feminist narrative grift is sort of has its own tradition. It has its own, let's say, cultural sanctity of people are used to tolerating it. They aren't used to saying, well, it doesn't sound like you've been calculating these accusations from first premises and from basic principles and values. It sounds like you've cherry-picked a narrative, and anyway, sorry. This also slightly dovetails to the point that I like to make about the corruption of academia, but specifically the misuse of statistics and sociology. And sociology, really, to be used properly, must be understood as a subsidiary of moral philosophy. Sociology is always laden with moral philosophy. You cannot make a model of a structure and a measurement of something without understanding that you have implicit within that model a certain hypothesis, a certain moral framework that you are and if you don't track and account for that framing, um, you know, you're going to treat the human condition in a very unprincipled way, and in this way, uh, I mean, this is the missing intellectual, sort of procedure and systematicity of thinking and coherence of thinking, which allows academia to sort of weave its narrative spin, and of all these buzzwords that just get repeated, and all this kind of low grade nonsense of the so-called race and gender studies professors, who are at least in the South African context, these are propaganda artists. These are overt racialist and fascistic identitarians or ideologues. They produce anti-constitutional propaganda. They should be fined and jailed. They are really poisonous for the body politic. They have performed constitutional damages. They should be brought to book, but instead they essentially provide the intellectual cover for even constitutional judges to acquiesce to the betrayal of basic constitutional values, the institutionalized corruption of the jurisprudence itself in the reinterpretation of the Constitution, the complete mangling and contortion of the limitations clauses, the shirking of the basic role and constitutional duty of the court. Anyway, that's a separate topic. But basic common values, integrity, principles, that is what gets destroyed, and what they've been deteriorated to such an extent that people tolerate the psychological penetration of basic boundaries in people's own mentality. You can't use slurs anymore because it is basically seen that it's not the individual that has a right to their freedom of conscience, it is the group entity that has a right to some kind of racialist pride. We already live in a kind of totalitarian cultural milieu, and it's that is only going to ever be reframed. That cultural space is only ever going to be retaken. And so I tried to talk about this issue about slurs, but there was something, when people use slurs, it was a way of saying, I'm not going to reveal to you my intimate reasoning and thinking about these issues from first principles. I'm just going to use a word that obviously has maybe a generic or a common understanding of what it means, but it has a personal charge that you are fronting using that word. That was the function of a slur. And yes, it related to generalizations and stereotypes often. And so slurs that did this meant that the individual had the right to make categories, that any individual could create their own category system of society and create their own generalizations and stereotypes, and in some sense they could communicate that on some level. Obviously it's a bit in the extreme circumstance when you're talking about slurs, but essentially people could have their own personal views of these things. And I do think it's impossible to live in a society without having generalizations. The question is, how do you morally comport them? How do you utilize them? And that's where morality comes in. It's not to not have generalizations. It's how to curtail their unconscious or let's say, because I don't think that you can not have them. You can't destroy having generalizations, but you can control them, essentially. Coleman Hughes explains this quite brilliantly in one of his early essays, I think even, on non-racialism, essentially, or I can't remember what he calls it, or color blindness. I can't remember the term that he uses, but the point that I'm making is that we used to have individuals had the freedom of conscience to communicate their own personal and everyone has personal interpretations of these things. People, I think, must have a personal view of different gender stereotypes. That is how they're going to populate the world and navigate the world to some degree, especially when they're young. If you can't codify the world in such a way, you can't ever mount and grow in an understanding of it. You have to populate the world with low resolution objects before you can start discerning higher resolution, lower resolution objects and categories until you can have higher level resolution, sophisticated nuance. And obviously the capability of generating nuance that breaks all the low resolution filters, as it were. And then you control your filters, not by never developing them in the first place. And individuals used to have the latitude to do that. And this, I think, was this is represented by people using slurs. Now it's impossible to use slurs. Why? Because it's not the individual that has a freedom of conscience. It is somehow the collective entity. It is the group that has a right to a social prestige or a social territory. I mean, it's atrocious. We have plugged ourselves into the matrix of identitarianism, and even by just culturally towing that rope. And to me, the solution is making a demarcated cultural space that says, don't play that game here, you're not welcome. That we reject you. We're going to make our own university, and the only identitarianism that we're going to discuss is debunking it and essentially, intellectually breaking it down and showing how it's wrong, but we find you morally repugnant, and we find you a den of racialists, and you have no functioning proper morality, and no thank you, and you're intellectually sort of mashed potatoes. And until we have sort of some kind of, let's say, Jonathan Haidt developed the Heterodox Academy. I think that you need a similar kind of rating agencies, but not for heterodoxy, for actually saying, no, this syllabus doesn't have any of the diversity and inclusion, indoctrination and propaganda, that we need to actually start vetting institutions and saying, well, this institution has a clean bill of health, they don't have hiring practices that are this weird kind of interventionist, racialist, sexist bullshit of quotas and propping people up and creating artificial double standards all over the place that create disgusting identitarian consciousness and gum everything up and destroy authentic relations between people. Because how can you have a genuine working relationship with someone who essentially got their job to fill a quota or to promote their faction, their identity category? You can't have vicarious pride. You can't be a token of some vicarious ideological redistribution plan. It's denigrating to everyone involved. And in some sense, it can only be justified if you really believe in the racial consciousness or identitarian consciousness that is dictating that kind of disgusting interventionism and mediation over human affairs. I mean, you're installing an ideological computer into the human interconnectedness. And there needs to be a concerted resilience that is developed. And the only way to have a concerted resilience to this is to set up institutions that have procedures in place that have from principles and values that cut it out. Because you can't just make hard and fast cuts. You have to make a system, a cultural system that can police it out. You can't just sort of have a witch hunt and throw them out. You have to create a sentry system. You have to create a guard post. You have to create a system that then we can defend, and that we can say, yes, this has values, and we can vindicate it legally, and then we have a model of how to do it, and it can also spread that way as well. But we need to create fences and demarcation and say, we don't want you here. We don't like you. We find you immoral. Go away. I think that is the only way that we're going to bring back sanity, I think. Otherwise, just going to get boiled alive like the frog. Because this racial consciousness and identitarian consciousness it is implicitly democratically illiterate. You end up voting for things that make absolutely no sense. You don't understand the first thing about policy. You have you explode a kind of democratic deficit. You explode political unaccountability. You promote a kind of leadership that is fundamentally putrid and divisive, but also palpably it's a kind of controlled failure so that it can prove its own ideological premise. It's a self-fueling grievance disempowerment scam so that it can prove that people are disempowered. That's all it does, is that you end up growing racial consciousness and identitarian consciousness is the only thing that it promotes. Everything else is destroyed and controlled and sort of regulated into a congealed, gummed up structure. Anyway, so I'm talking broadly now. Let me stop talking. But it must be diagnosed as a moral corruption. That is the most important thing. It is the moral corruption that then leads to these other corruptions. It's a corruption of morality, and unless it's defended on that level, and unless it's demarcated, and we have sentries, and we have institutions that are guarded by saying, no, we have a different morality to you, everything else is just buying into their conflagration, buying into the fights that they set up. They say, oh, we don't like your nationalism. Yes, they are trying to dissolve civic nationalism because national identity brings people together, and it's a threat to their racial consciousness and racial and identitarian their scapegoating categorization, which is built on their identitarian matrix. So they have to destroy things like that's why they need people in sports to take the knee, to supplicate the civic nationalism to their identitarian consciousness. But don't try to save national identity. Don't fight for national identity. Don't fight for patriotism. Fight for morality. Fight for morality first, and then explain that their attack on patriotism is born out of their immorality. But don't defend patriotism as the first thing, because then you're playing into their game. You're playing into their narrative. You're fighting the fight as they have set it up. Anyway, I guess that's my treatment of the whole thing. And I think I did actually make a good archetypal description of this, is that if you're fighting the Hydra, and I might be conflating some Greek things, I might be mixing and matching, but I think it's good enough. I might be conflating this with Medusa, but and I think that this is not entirely true as well, because I'm perhaps adding the Aegis the shield of Pallas Athena. I believe it was Paris. I might be so wrong. I believe it was Paris that killed. Maybe it was Heraclitus. Man, I don't even know who Heraclitus was, but I think it was Paris that killed Medusa, and I think he did so. Maybe it was just his own regular shield, but the point that I made is that you can't confront Medusa. You can't try to debate them. They don't even, if you try to debate them, they don't debate. They don't have an intellectual argument. All they will do is say, it's so stupid that I even have to pretend to debate you because you're already wrong. And then they kind of laugh at you. They pretend that they're a comedian. Because that's all they can do is scoff at you, because they are the satirist, or they are I mean, that's why they kill comedy, is because their whole intellectual argument is that they have to use the sort of the comic shtick in order to subvert their combatant. They have to steal the orthodoxy. They have to pretend that the audiences automatically should be on their side and must be treated on their side. That they are sharing an intimate, personal joke with reality, and this other person is not in on the joke. They don't get the interpretation. And it's this weird kind of special pleading is the only way that they have debates and argue, where they get to chair the debate. They also give themselves this ability to have this kind of moral sanctimoniousness. And in some sense, that's the problem of debating with them, is the only way to capture them in that is you have to recapitulate their whole position. You have to recast their whole, what they're doing in a bigger narrative that describes them. And so you just then end up vomiting narratives against each other, and you can say, well, my narrative is more accurate and descriptive and places you and accounts for what you're doing more accurately, and then they will say, well, you're just an agent of the patriarchy or something. But so it doesn't ever, it can't be resolved on the level of that. But what was the point that I was getting at? What was the point about arguing with them? So I was on a point talking about arguing with them. So I was saying you can't argue with them. What can you do? Was that the point? So I'm just trying to find my thread now. I was describing the archetypal version of doing that. Okay, so the archetypal version of doing that is that you can't confront Medusa. You can't look directly into the gaze of Medusa, then, because you'll just turn to stone. You can't, and what I'm saying, the translation of this is that you can't dignify. Actually, I don't know how the Hydra was killed, or if it was just overcome eventually by some kind of brute force. But you can't look at Medusa in the eyes, because she's just dead in the eyes. You look her in the eyes, you turn to stone, and you can't just cut off a head of the hydralisk because it's meaningless. Two more will grow in its place. What you have to do is you can't dignify it by fighting any of its heads. You can't dignify the Hydra by cutting off any of its heads. You can't dignify Medusa by gazing her in the face. You have to look at a reflection of her in a shield. And I believe that the shield was the Aegis, and Aegis was made for Athena by her father Zeus, and the Aegis was a mythical shield that was made out of the hide of Amalthea, and Amalthea was the great sheep that suckled Zeus when Zeus was cast down, out of heavens to protect him from being eaten by his father Kronos. But so Amalthea is the symbol of nurture, is the symbol of the beastly creature comforts that is need, the basic practical things that are needed to grow and develop, and gave all the sustenance that grew the patriarch of the gods, Zeus. And so it's the basic necessities of creature growth, as it were. And so you see a reflection of Medusa in the gleam of the shield, of the Aegis shield. So I archetypally, that I think is how you see the reflection of this Hydra, of this Medusa, is that you don't confront it directly. You have to subsume it into a more pragmatic view of what it is, and that is the reflection in the gleam of the shield of Aegis, which is made out of the hide of Amalthea. Anyway, that's how I read it. But and I don't know how the Hydra was killed. If it was just stabbed in its trunk, or if it was I have no idea how the Hydra. I don't know the story exactly of how the Hydra was overcome, but anyway, it serves as an explanation. Okay, I think I've gone over everything that I wanted to talk about on this matter. The only thing that I didn't add, which is quite a sophisticated thing, which if anyone is essentially the Nietzschean Christian angle of this, and the God of the world, and a narrative, and that is hidden in the 8.5 hour thing. Which, if you're interested in just that, it's probably in sort of somewhere in the last 3 hours, or in the last 4 hours. It's going to be somewhere there. I would just skip over the first 4 hours, because that is probably psychobabble that people might not be interested in, to do with personality theory. But anyway, that's enough, I think.